Hi friends, Rick Edwards here with Sunday School University. Thank you for joining me for another video. This particular video is another contextual video. That means it is not specific to a lesson, but rather provides some context in which you can understand the different lessons, the different sessions that are being studied. This particular video is going to be essentially an overview of the two books of 1st and 2nd Kings, okay? So that's where we're going. It's not specific to a lesson. So some things we need to point out. First of all, we need to understand that originally the book of 1st and 2nd Kings were just one book. There was only one book, unified author, unified story, telling the story of 1st and 2nd Kings. So if you hear me refer to the book of Kings, I'm referring to the joint or the collective books here, 1st and 2nd Kings together. Originally they were one king. In your Bible and my Bible, we'll see 1st and 2nd Kings, but originally it was just one. So you really, as you read, you're reading straight from 1st Kings to 2nd Kings. And when you want to look at the beginning of the story, you go to 1st Kings chapter 1. When you want to look at the end of the story, you go to 2nd Kings chapter 25. The first chapter in the book and the last chapter in the book. Okay, so keep all that in mind. Now, what's the purpose of these two books of this single Kings? Well, pretty simply, the purpose is to show the inadequacy of the human monarchy. The human monarchy, these human kings, it's just not cutting it. It's just not accomplishing what God wants to accomplish. The people are not being who He wants them to be. The kings are not accomplishing what He wants them to accomplish. The people of Israel are not any different from anybody else. So when you get to the end of 2nd Kings, the book of Kings, what you come away with is a clear sense that this simply isn't working. The human monarchy simply is inadequate. Now, let me point out a couple of things to help you see this. First of all, I want you to note the bookends. What do I mean by that? Well, oftentimes in literature or in among the biblical writings, an author will take a section and he will bookend it with something at the beginning, something at the end, and they may be similar or they may be contrasting, but the idea is the bookends, the narrative bookends, help us go, oh, okay, everything in between the bookends is important, but the bookends often help set up and provide the context to understand what comes in between. In the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, the book of Kings has such bookends. So we go to 1st Kings chapter 1, and then we go to 2nd Kings chapter 25, the very end of the book, and we see at the beginning an interesting little story about David, and at the end another interesting little story about the King Jehoiakim. It's Jehoiakim with an N as in the word no, okay? So a little interesting story at the beginning, an interesting story at the end. Let me just point out how this works. So if you go to 1 Kings chapter 1, and don't worry about turning there, I'm just going to read part of this to you so you hear it. First verse. Now King David was old and getting on in years. Now that tells us right away that even though David was the greatest king that ever lived and went down in history as their greatest king, even though Solomon was wise and had enormous wealth, really David is considered the great king. He was the king that all the other kings got compared to. But even David, guess what? Even David is getting old. So, although they covered him with bedclothes, he could not get warm. So it goes on to tell here that in order to help keep him warm, they found a young woman, a beautiful young woman. They made him part of David's harem. So she was like his wife or potential concubine. And even though she was in his harem, probably because he was too old, it says he was not intimate with her. And the point of this story is that David, even the great David, has reached a point where he has diminished power, diminished capacity, we might say. He cannot perform the duties of a king, and he can't even do the things that he once did. David has reached a point where he is failing. Then you go down to the end of 2 Kings, chapter 25, and there's another interesting little story about King Jehoiakim. Again, it ends with an N, contrasting Jehoiakim with Jehoiakim, as in mom. Don't get the two confused. So you get to the end of 2 Kings chapter 25, the very end of the book. And what you discover is an interesting little story here that Jehoiakim, who is now in exile in Babylon, he is essentially a prisoner in Babylon, but a new king comes along and pardons him. And it says, he was pardoned, he was released from prison in verse 28. The new king spoke kindly to him and set Jehoiakim's throne over the thrones of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim changed his prison clothes, and he dined regularly in the presence of the king of Babylon for the rest of his life. He's even given a daily stipend to live on his own, but in Babylon. Now you might read this and go, that's not a bad deal. Okay? He was taken there as a prisoner. After a while, he's released. He's not allowed to go back to Judah, though. So he's here, and he's given the title of king, but he doesn't have the power of a king, not a true king. So just like David in the first part of 1 Kings, at the very beginning, has a diminished kingly ability, so this king, Jehoiakim, has a diminished kingly ability. He may be king in title, but that's about all. He has no real power as king. And for all practical purposes, neither did David, even in 1 Kings. So these two stories bookend this entire book of Kings that records all the kings that come in between. And when you get to it, when you get done, you realize the main purpose of these books, the main message of these books, is that the human monarchy is simply inadequate. Now, there's a little bit of a timing issue here. This is that I want to point out just so you understand, because depending on where you look and who you talk to and what you read, there's some confusion over whether Jehoiakim, the one we were just talking about, whether he was the last king or not. And that's because when you get to the end of 2 Kings, chapter 24, verse 15, what we discover is that Jehoiakim is king. Well, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, conquers Jerusalem, and deports Jehoiakim to Babylon. So chapter 24, verse 15 says Nebuchadnezzar deported Jehoiakim to Babylon. So now Jehoiakim is this, although he's been king, he's deported to Babylon and put in prison. Nebuchadnezzar reports or replaces Jehoiakim with his uncle and changes his name to Zedekiah. And so Zedekiah becomes king at this point. Now, if this is all we knew, then we would have to say that Jehoiakim was king, but Zedekiah was king after him in Judah, in Jerusalem. Therefore, Zedekiah would be the final king. However, we keep reading on, and in chapter 15, early in chapter 15, Zedekiah rebels against Babylon, rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, defeats Zedekiah, blinds him after he kills his sons, and then takes him to Babylon. So now, both kings, Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, are now prisoners in Babylon. So who's the last king? Well, if that's all we know, we would say, well, Zedekiah was the last king, except for that little interesting story we just read. That's all we know about Zedekiah. For all practical purposes, he disappears. But if you go to the end, as we read a moment ago, Jehoiakim, apparently some 30-some years later, Jehoiakim is still alive and is reinstated as king, but he's king in Babylon. So, in case there's some confusion about this, Jehoiakim was not the last king in Israel or in Judah, in Jerusalem. That was Zedekiah. But he was the last, I believe, the last living Davidic king. Both he and Zedekiah were descendants of David. So both were Davidic kings. The last king to rule in Jerusalem was Zedekiah. But the last king to live and to be alive, in all likelihood, was Jehoiakim, which is why I believe the author chooses this little story at the end of Kings to say he is the final living Davidic king, Just as David was the first Davidic king, obviously at the beginning of Kings, Jehoiakim is the last Davidic king, the last living Davidic king. Again, making the point, first and last of the dynasty, making the point that if you go all the way through the dynasty, all the way through the Davidic dynasty, starting with David, all the way to Jehoiakim, you discover it simply wasn't working. The monarchy was inadequate to do what God wanted it to do. Now, another thing I would point out very quickly is that the book of 1st and 2nd Kings records back and forth all the kings of Israel and Judah, okay? And it compares each one to David, and it does an assessment. It says the king was either good or evil, good or evil, good or evil. Well, in the case of Israel, the northern tribe, none of Israel's kings were good. 0 for 20. 0 for 20. None of the northern tribes, northern kingdoms, kings were good. None of them measured up. So in the case of Israel, the northern kingdom, the human monarchy was a total failure. Even in Judah, didn't fare a whole lot better. In Judah, 20 kings, only 8 of the 20 get a positive rating from the writer of Kings. Only 8 do any good. And in most cases, it was a matter of being too little, too late. Even though some of them may have tried, it was just too late. The nation could not be saved. Why? Because the human monarchy simply wasn't adequate to accomplish what God wanted to accomplish through them. So, some interesting history here, real quick. If you go to back to the book of Judges, and we have videos about this that you can go and look at. When you get to the end of Judges, we discover that the primary message of the book of Judges is that we need a king. We need a king. That's because it says over and over, there was no king in Israel. Everybody just did what they wanted. It was a terrible situation. And then you move into 1 Samuel, where God begins to provide for them a king. So you get out of the book, you end the book of Judges with this message, we need a king. But then you get into 1 Kings later, 1st and 2nd Kings, the book of Kings, and you discover that the monarchy that has been established back in 1 Samuel, this monarchy is not going to work. It's not working either. The period of the judges did not work, and the period of the monarchy is not working. So the message at the end of Judges is, we need a king. But the message at the end of Kings is, we need a different kind of a king. And that is a very important distinction and an important message for us to grasp when we think about the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. We have to walk away with an understanding that the human monarchy failed, but there is hope, because the lineage that God has been developing through the Davidic dynasty, he's promised that there would come a king, an eternal king from the line of David eventually. He hasn't come yet, not in 1st and 2nd Kings, but he's going to come. We know him from a New Testament perspective. We know that king is Jesus. But before you ever get to the New Testament, it's clear when you read the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, it's clear that the kind of kings we've been having, the human monarchy, simply isn't going to cut it. It's inadequate. We need a different kind of king. And if you'll keep that in mind as you study through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, it will help you understand what's going on here, because God is wanting us to see this just isn't working, but I have a plan to bring a better king, a greater king, an eternal king one of these days in the person of Jesus, the Messiah. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great week.